So I have the great pleasure today of being in conversation with Professor Lee Baker. He is professor of cultural anthropology, sociology, and African American studies at Duke University, where he served for nearly a decade as the Dean of Academic Affairs. His honors include the Distinguished Achievement Prize in Critical Study of North America, and he is a Ford Fellow and a Fellow of the American Philosophical Society and the National Humanities Center. Dr. Baker's books include two monographs, From Savage to Negro, Anthropology and the Construction of Race, 1896 through 1954, and Anthropology and the Racial Politics of Culture. He is published in a wide range of journals in anthropology, sociology, African American studies, and more. His titles are often quite witty. My favorite is For Whom the Bell Curve Tolls, Power, Money, and Multiculturalism, published in the journal Identities. Dr. Baker has focused particularly on the complex way that American anthropology has, since the 18th century, positioned itself as the science that takes interpreting race and culture as its core mission. His work is always pushed beyond in-house disciplinary views in favor of examining, in his own words, how scholarly interpretations of race have not been left idle in an ivory tower, but have been an active part in that social machinery that constructs racial categories, even as that machinery has helped sustain the discourse of anthropology. Nothing like being quoted back to yourself, right? Indeed, he focuses on how lawmakers, journalists, and judges have used anthropological and sociological perspectives, even as anthropologists have accommodated their theories to broader shifts between overtly racist policies and those oriented towards principles of justice and equality. Dr. Baker's decades of tracing how race, racism, and anti-racist activism operate within anthropology, sociology, and folkloristics, and exploring ways that social scientific research on race sometimes matters and sometimes has little impact, could not be more timely and significant than at this particular historical juncture. I thus feel deeply honored to be able to virtually sit down with you today and ask you to talk about your work and your life and share your thoughts about our presents and possible futures. So I'll start off with a question for you. We are now immersed in a moment in which awareness of white supremacy, state violence against racialized populations, and the new visibility of the long-standing anti-racist social movements has broken through the strategies of silencing to become the national conversation. It would thus be easy to see your choice to study the work of such leading figures as W.E.B. Du Bois and Franz Boas on the politics of race in the United States as well, just like natural. But From Savage to Negro was published over 20 years ago. So could you trace for us, and particularly for students who are faced with making their own choices about what to research and how to research it, what was the path that brought you to anthropology and particularly to Boas and Du Bois?
Wow, that's a great introduction and a great question. And so the path to Du Bois and Boas, that's an interesting discussion. So I don't know if you know some of my personal history, but when I was adopted and to a white family in the 1960s, and I kind of grew up in the suburbs of Corvallis, Oregon, and just not a lot of African Americans there. There were a few. The basketball players took me in. The women's basketball players actually took me in. I was I was doing dishes for them at the dormitory, and they just like adopted me. It was a lot of fun. But I did not have a lot of experience with African Americans. But I did have experience with Australian Aboriginals. I was when I was in high school, I did an exchange to Australia, and they put me with a middle-class Aboriginal family in just the outback, the northwest corner, 13 degrees south latitude. And I was learning about the African-American experience and studying it, but also then having a immersive experience looking at how racialized Black people in Australia were just being crushed under the weight of sort of institutional racism that kind of both doubled the Black racism in the United States with the Native American experience. So it was almost like a double whammy. So then when I got to college, I was like, oh, I'm just going to be an anthropologist, because I didn't really know what anthropology was as an 18-year-old, but I had all these experiences with different cultures and race and being racialized without having the sort of cultural mechanisms to understand it. So then one of the real great aspects of African American culture is it teaches you how to deal with the caste system, how to deal with racism. But if you don't have the cultural wherewithal and you're just racialized, it's hard to then navigate and negotiate that. So I was experienced on all of that, and anthropology indeed helped me figure this all out in a really sort of compelling way. I was taking Black Studies. That's when they called it Black Studies. I think they still call it Black Studies at Portland State. So this is Portland State University, and anthropology at the same time. And what I didn't quite appreciate was that the people in Black Studies were not necessarily talking to the people in anthropology. And I was going back and forth to my professors, hey, did you see this? I was all very excited. Did you see that? And they both were like, that's interesting, did not. And I had some great mentors, and they encouraged me to really pursue this intersection between Black Studies and anthropology. And I, of course, thought I was going to do that as an ethnographer. And so thinking that I would bring sort of Black studies to Indigenous studies in Australia. So as a junior, I think, or a senior in college, I go back to Australia, and this was 88, I guess, and it was the 100th anniversary or 200th anniversary, and there was just a lot of marching and a lot of deaths in custody for Aboriginals, and Aboriginals were taking it on the chin one more time, trying to fight for land rights, trying to fight against police brutality, and at that time there was a lot of suicides in custody, so-called suicides, but were they just being killed or were they being suicide? Probably a combination of both. Long story short, however, I go back to Australia, and at this time, my peers were in college, and they were writing, they were doing radio, they were making movies. I was just blown away by the effort of the young Aboriginals to try to confront the racism. And being an anthropologist, I said, well, I can't help here. They're already doing everything. And so they were the ones throwing me some bones in terms of, oh, you go talk to Granny over there, or make sure you talk to that person. And they didn't really value, nor did they think anthropology was going to help the racism in Australia. And they liked me, and we were friends, and we had this shared Black experience. But right then and there, I found that I couldn't do anything to help or even contribute. So I decided I wasn't going to be an ethnographer. Now, and then I go to grad school knowing that I'm not going to do ethnography. It's not usually, I don't really advise that. But at that time, I started really looking at Zora Neale Hurston. I started looking at Boaz. I started looking at Booker T. Washington and all these sort of connections. So I began doing research as a first-year graduate student on the intersection of all these players during the Harlem Renaissance. And, you know, Tom Patterson, who was my advisor, kind of said, you know, this is pretty good, Lee. Not a lot of people are doing this. And he really kind of encouraged me. He said, well, you might not get a job, but this is really important research. And even George Stocking at that time, who was the doyen of history of anthropology, said, this is really good, but you might not get a job in anthropology. And I kind of shrugged my shoulders saying, and this is good advice, I think, for any graduate student. If you're not sort of super into your research and you don't think it's important, you're not going to get a job anyway. So I kind of literally kind of shrug my shoulders and say, I think I'm onto something. I think this is a good niche. And at that time, moving forward, this is right when a lot of aspects of the Newt Gingrich's contract with America, the Republicans were asserting themselves. The Bell curve was just kind of coming on again. It seems like every 30 years the bell curve comes up. So I think we're probably due for another one anytime now. So that's a long answer to why I kind of got into this, but it came as questions about race and culture percolated in high school. And then I got to college, and anthropology helped answer some of these questions, not just anthropology, but Black studies as well. And then finally understanding that ethnography, I think, like Charles, your ethnography, I think ethnography is important. I just sort of made a decision politically and in terms of my own, like, I'm not going to go out there and talk to people and make my career on it. I'm going to go study anthropology. So I really think I do the anthropology of anthropology, and I'm kind of stuck with it. I've done a lot of other things, but that's a long answer to your great question.
Well, that's a wonderful answer. As one thing that occurred to me is, of course, central to one of Du Bois's most powerful notions is that of double consciousness, which maybe, if you wouldn't mind defining, there might be some people listening who would know what it is. What would you say in terms of this amazing experience that you had? What would be your equivalent of a moment of double consciousness?
I can't remember the exact quote, but it's being able to see yourself both as an American and then behind the veil, or as a marginalized Black person. So you have equal claim on the identity of sort of being having a national identity, but never really being able to claim that because you're a racialized sort of other. So it's quite literally you're betwixt and between. And that for Du Bois, at least, having that double consciousness was really a gift, because you could see from multiple perspectives, and it really generated a lot of empathy. And empathy wasn't hot back then, but it is kind of now. But I think it really was a tool for Du Bois to really understand how people can at once claim a national identity, but never quite achieve that. And for me, I guess I get these pangs of double consciousness all the time, because I can see, and you can imagine also in families, having a biracial family, people with good white liberals, they were like, I see it this way. And I was like, honey, I know you think you do, but you don't. And it's and it's really hard to break through people's sincerity in terms of thinking that they are seeing the world through someone else's eye, when they just simply cannot have that experience, particularly with other family members and the like. So that has been informative personally to me, but I think it has also informed my research.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I just thought, in some sense, developing a sense of double consciousness in Australia is a very fascinating sort of different route.
It is a different route, and that's where and that's right. That's where I really came to sort of understand double consciousness, particularly from the Aboriginals I was with, because they were the so-called stolen generation, and so they were considered half caste, and then once they grew up and went to college, came back and reclaimed their Aboriginality. But there was they didn't necessarily know the language. There was a big gulf between the traditional folks living in the essentially reservations and the educated folks, but they were really committed, and they worked through those differences and did the genealogy to establish these connections. And it was a different route, but it shaped my life forever.
Fascinating. So one of the things that I most admire about your work is your deep sense of engagement with Boas and Du Bois. Rather than distant historical figures, readers are offered the opportunity to sit beside them and witness their struggles to confront entrenched forms of racism. If a young anti-racism activist today who is unfamiliar with these figures were to ask you, what basic lessons would you draw from their work and life that might be most helpful to these young activists today in grasping what's taking place in the contemporary United States and charting a more just and equitable future? What would you tell them? So, what might be for somebody the kind of takeaway for Boas and Du Bois for today?
So, I, the takeaway is almost like hubris. Both men just thought they could change the world based on their own intellectual power. And there's something about reading through their correspondence individually and together, and the the drive just to make this place better. Now, Du Bois originally was going to stick with science, and he shifted and goes more what he calls propaganda, but he was more of a public intellectual. And Boas kind of doubles and triple down on science. But to have the sort of wherewithal to keep every single letter, and in Boas's case, copies of the letter he sent out. I mean, he kind of knew, I think he knew he was trying to change history, or at least there was some white male privilege there to assume I'm that important. Someone's going to want to know about this after I'm dead. And same thing with Du Bois. But nevertheless, their sense of purpose, commitment, and on the other hand, sort of vulnerabilities, which you also get is that these are real people. And for a time, Du Bois was broke. I mean, you get these letters, saying, I just can't make it to this conference because I don't have the money. Same thing with Boas. There was times where even though he came from money and had rich uncles and stuff, you would just see, that they just don't have the financial wherewithal to make the big decisions, but that didn't deter them. They were sort of really focused on change. So to me, that's important, just because I'm inspired by their sense of purpose. The other piece of this, though, is there were equally numbers of women that had the same drive and the same purpose, but because they didn't keep such perfect records, they are not placed in history. And so you can see sort of sexism and just that the sort of privilege of being a male to know I'm a leader and know that what I'm doing is important. Other equally important leaders in these movements are kind of sidelined because the historical records just isn't there in the same way. So people that have done the biographies of people like Anna Julia Cooper or Ida B. Wells, my hat is off to them because they're working with a lot less exact materials than I've had the privilege of doing. I mean, I can't, having typewriters back then makes all the difference, because now it's so much easier to just read a letter than some of the people I've worked with, D.G. Brenton, for example. That handwriting back in the day with those quill pens or those fountain pens, it's tough to read. And so I don't know if that makes sense, but the sense of purpose and that is, to me, has been inspiring. But knowing that is a privileged position, and Ida B. Wells, other people had that same sense, but they're sort of marginalized from history just because they didn't have that same hubris.
Great. So I'm going to quote you again. I'm sorry. You write that Boas's contributions were singularly significant, but he did not work alone. Without the wider social and political efforts of Du Bois, the NAACP, and scholars at Howard University, Boas's contributions to the changing signification of race would have been limited to the academy. What sorts of transformative coalitions between scholarly and other communities do you see emerging today? And what role can they play in fostering justice and equality?
That's a great question. I think, what role can they play? Excuse me. I think today, some of our best scholars are not writing books, but they are making an impact through popular culture in different venues. I'm thinking about Ava DuVernay, who is a scholar, but she produced that award-winning Netflix movie called The 13th, which has educated a whole vast number of people on the prison industrial complex. And people like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who did the 1619 Project in the New York Times, which was a multimedia sort of thing. I just believe those sorts of academic pursuits are having a greater impact than just writing another book. Sorry, Charles, I know we're in that business, but I think that, working in coalitions with that, I think is important. I've also been impressed with people like Mark Anthony Neal, my colleague here at Duke, who's teamed up with Colin Kaepernick and other rappers and media stars, and really blurring the genres between scholarship and popular culture and activism, oftentimes through the literary texts, but also through interviews and through Twitter, through YouTube, a whole range of different sort of platforms. So it is incumbent, I think, that we use coalitions, that we also bring our tools as academics and scholars to bear in this, but really team up with people who are experts in other genres that are more easily consumed.
Fascinating. By the way, I want to apologize to the audience. My internet was failing at home, so I had to get special permission to come into campus, and the internet wasn't working up in my office. So I'm sitting in the copy room. So if you heard a little noise back there and someone walks in, and I put my mask on, you'll know why. You write that despite producing a robust body of research and helping to empower African Americans, and again I quote your words, African American scholars who forayed into the anthropological field of folklore immediately met with marginalization, end quote, thereby affording their work little influence on anthropological discourses of race and culture. You note that despite Zora Neale Hurston's position as the leading Black folklorist in the United States, she was largely marginalized within the field of anthropology. In the book From Boaz to Black Power, anthropologist Mark Anderson recounts how a number of Black anthropologists who were radicalized by the politics of the 1960s and critically analyzed how racism operates within scholarly perspectives, including within anthropology. He reports that their efforts were often suppressed even by their own advisors, and that their professional futures were sometimes squashed. So what I want to ask you is, have things changed? What barriers and difficult choices do Black anthropologists face today? And what are the costs of challenging the racial status quo? Are they as high?
Yeah, oh gosh, this is recording, huh? Like, I don't know where to start. So,
well, people need to hear your words, so jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be surprising to anyone that anthropology has articulated many of the same patterns of sort of discrimination, white supremacy, and exclusion than many other institutions and or fields in the United States. So anthropology was perhaps a little bit more progressive, although Mark Anderson, I really value his work, would probably argue otherwise. But nevertheless, people that are trying to make it in the academy have back then, had very few options except for teaching in historically Black colleges and universities. The irony is that for reasons that I explain in the book, folklore celebrated African American culture and really valued it, but it was the cabin culture or not the elite culture. So HBCUs were loath to hire anthropologists to talk about the more vernacular culture, because they wanted racial uplift, they wanted civilization, they didn't want to celebrate the juke joints and the lumber mills. They wanted to get away from that. So then there's very few opportunities for anthropologists. that has continued to today. And if you look at many of the people in the Association of Black Anthropologists, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's an empirical number. Many, if not most, are appointed in women's studies and Black studies and folklore programs. They're not appointed, their primary appointment, in anthropology department. So that pattern actually continues and will continue unless we are very both deliberate, strategic, and dialed in to try to develop more anthropologists both at the undergrad and grad level. Anthropology has been very supportive of Black and Brown anthropologists because other Black and Brown anthropologists have mentored them, have supported them, and uplifted them. And I think with others as well, but it's rough, and we just don't continue, particularly for the Native American anthropologists is even more difficult because of the historical relationship between anthropology and
Oh dear, we seem to be having a moment where the Zoom is not operating.
And so I am of both the opinion and believe sincerely that if anthropology is going to be around towards the balance of this century, towards the other century, like its third century, we have to diversify the professoriate, and we have to be both strategic and deliberate in terms of making sure they're more indigenous, Latinos, African Americans that are coming through the undergraduate program, going to graduate school, and then entering the professoriate, because we will not be relative or even relevant. And that also then means we have to be more inclusive and supportive of students that are coming through the pipeline and provide them both the space to get creative, but also the support to actually transform and decolonize anthropology for the 21st century.
It's a great answer. I might suggest that we might want to look at the reasons why the academy is not more diverse, why so many anthropologists, non-white anthropologists, are teaching in other departments. What are some of the issues that graduate students face as they go through? What are issues that relate to tenure with respect to getting your work published by leading book publishers or in leading journals? What is the peer review process? In other words, I think it's going to really take a lot of clear thinking and critical thinking about how it is that anthropology and folkloristics and other disciplines are put together, and how it is that white supremacy and racism operates within them. So I would maybe specifically focus the question, what kind of price is going to be paid precisely by Black, Latinx, and Native American anthropologists if they do that critical work?
Well, I think it I think that's a good question. I don't have a ready answer, but I think what has to happen is it has to be a team effort. And it's not going to be just one Du Bois or Boas. It's got to be a networked approach, because the costs are too high in terms of family time, in terms of people's mental health, their physical health. If you just have, 5 or 6 people leading the charge and giving their all. And so I think we have to work. I think the ABA is that's the Association of Black Anthropologists, is a wonderful model for transformative change, because everyone is very dialed in and sort of mindful that we cannot overwork each individual person, that we have to have shared responsibilities. And there's a real ethic and practice of pitching in and supporting individual leaders, but then enabling others to help out, and sort of much more of a networked and distributed approach to change, and we work well together, and incrementally we're we're at least trying to change some of these structures and institutions that really, like you said, it's these patterns and structures of white supremacy that are being reproduced in the organizations that we use to professionalize and advance our careers. And being able to sit back and understand that, and then pick it apart and identify the problematic elements, I think is crucial.
By the way, I don't know if you realize this, but you tied together three of the big issues we've been talking about with that one wonderful statement. So that was great. Thank you so much for that. You argue that Boas confronted anthropology's active participation in legitimizing racist policies directed at Blacks and Native Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that as a result, the discipline came to play a significant role in producing more equitable laws and policies. So in other words, anthropology made a difference. What about the present? Does anthropology play as an important role in shaping the politics of race today?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. Not. I think we wish I think well, I think we wish we'd like to, but no, back in the day, I think it's important. It was the science of race and culture. And while it made important movements in terms of like these civil rights laws in the Plessy versus, Brown versus Board of Education, it was a tool to enable some of the laws that enabled civil rights. It also was the tool that made whiteness concrete. So Boas in his studies really showed that there were no differences between the Sicilian, the Hebrews, and that was important work that perhaps solidified white supremacy. So this is the challenge with racism, is that in George Fredrickson's notion, scavenger ideology, and it keeps adapting. So even though on the one hand, anthropology was used to enforce or combat racial segregation and dehumanization and the like, it was also used to make whiteness more concrete, which shored up white supremacy to be even more hegemonic. So that's the way racism works in the United States. It gives and it takes all the time. And I think, if anything, what the importance of anthropologists and anthropology and its cognate disciplines, like, well, I'll throw sociology, folklore, and the others, is that it gives us the tools to look at how white supremacy is a hegemonic component of sort of settler democracies. So white supremacy is even more pernicious when people believe that there's inequality. I mean, when people believe there's equality and justice for all. This is where you see this in Australia as well. So you need both institutionalized dehumanization and sort of industrialized terrorism to keep this hierarchy in place. As we believe in justice for all, equality, and having the social scientists be able to tear this apart and analyze the components of white supremacy in an American society that believes in justice and equality, I think is a critical contribution that we can make. And we need to keep pounding.
That's a wonderful statement. I don't know if you have any final words of wisdom before we sign off. I can only say I really have appreciated this. Thank you so much for sharing about yourself, about your life, the sort of forces that really placed you as an anthropologist, and why it is that you focus precisely. You've done that hard work of looking at the role of scholarship and its complexities and contradictions, which is what we need to do now for so long. And that's why I feel so privileged to be sitting down with you and being able to have you reflect on what you take out of that, in terms of giving of words, both of warning as well of inspiration, of guidance, partly about not trying to go alone, and also not trying to think that you're God, that you can transform the world overnight. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. As always, I really enjoy being in conversation with you, Lee.
Well, Charles, it's always great to have a conversation with you. I want to wish you all the best, and I hope that your students and your the people who ever watch this get something out of it. It was a great conversation, and I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's a tremendous contribution to many folks. All right, Lee, take good care.
All
Talk
right, thank you.
soon.